My name is Marina. I came from Ukraine, and I came to England to be in a team to organize such events like you are here. And this is a big privilege to have so many students here. And probably you've heard a lot about Ukraine, and I would like to show you several pictures. Probably you heard about the war between Russia and Ukraine. And so Russia tried to invade and capture eastern part of Ukraine. Actually, these pictures are taken recently. These are citizens, Ukrainians that try to escape from the city and go in nowhere because they do not know where they are going, but they need to leave the city. But the last thing that they have is the hope, and the hope is the last thing that actually they have. And I was so privileged when I was asked to come to Blokpost to soldiers, and it was May, and my parents were saying, like, Marina, we do not want to let you go there because it's like too dangerous. But I felt like I needed to go there because I had a hope too, and I wanted to show soldiers that they need to have a hope too. Because I think that life is too fragile, and we cannot be sure about tomorrow. But I'm sure if we base our life in God, we'll have a long life with Him together. So I went there and I played for them, starting from May, and I visited about 30 blokposts, and I was speaking with many commanders and soldiers, and they told me different horrible things like torturing when they were captured and something else. Since my last time, it was several weeks ago, 39 soldiers that I was playing to, they died. And every single time when I'm coming to them, I do not know if they will still be alive or not. And once after my last visit, one soldier was captured, and he was shown in TV, and I hardly recognized him because he was so changed in the face. But I know that I had the opportunity to give him a hope and to play the violin. And when I was visiting those soldiers, in different kind of like seasons, in summer or spring or during the winter, they were asking me, Marina, what are you doing here with your violin? Why are you coming here? Nobody comes here. And I just knew that I wanted to give them hope, the hope that God gave me. And this is the violin that survived the Second World War, and this is the violin that survives the Ukrainian war between Russia and Ukraine, and this is the violin that was touching many lives, and this is the violin that many soldiers touched. And as I was in Kiev, coming back from Blokpost, a friend soldier called to my friend, and he was saying, he's saying to my friend, please tell Marina that I would like to hear your violin after I come back, because he was going to the front. And I hope that he is still alive. I do not know if he is alive or not. And I remember really well the one commenter that told me. Actually, he was saying, Marina, I used to be an atheist, and he said, but when you're on the front, nobody is an atheist because you try to remember any kind of prayer that you have, any kind of prayer or hope that you just want to grab and hold it, because you know that you can die right now in this second. So this is kind of hope, and I want to bring this hope to you, to build your life and right things. And the composition that I'm going to play is called First Touch. This is the first touch of the violin, many soldiers and many lives, and
United States. It collided with another vessel and sank rapidly to the bottom of the ocean floor. Divers were scrambled to try and find out if anyone was still alive in the submarine. As they reached down to the depths of the ocean to the submarine, they heard a sound knocking from inside this stricken submarine. And as they listened more carefully, they realised the sound was actually the sound of Morse code being tapped out on the hull of this vessel. And as they listened again, they could work out what the message was that was being tapped out. And the message was this, simply this: is there any hope? Is there any hope? That's a big question, isn't it? Not just for stricken sailors in a submarine, but a big question for our world. As we look around our world at war and conflict and violence, is there any hope? It's a big question as we think about our lives, we think about our futures. Is there any hope? And it's a big question as we face the certain reality that one day every single one of us will die. Is there any hope? Well, the message of the New Testament and the message of Christianity is there is hope. One Christian writer put it this way, the Apostle Peter. He said, we've been born again into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. He's saying that Christianity is centred on this message of hope. Hope for now, hope for the world, and hope for the future. And the basis of that hope is none other than Jesus Christ. He is the one that gives it its base. This was brought home to me recently when I was down in South Africa. I love Cape Town, and I was there just a few weeks ago on holiday. And I was cycling down to this point, you can have the picture up, at Cape Point, just about 30 miles south of the beautiful city of Cape Town, most southwesterly point in Africa. And for many years, until 500 years ago, many sailors from Europe had tried to sail down past this point and beyond to see what lay beyond this point of Africa. But no one had successfully made it past it and back again. You see at this point the waters of the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans meet. There are many storms and high winds, and so it was an incredibly dangerous place to go. No one had lived to tell the tale. And so because of that, it was named the Cape of Storms. But then, in the 1500s, a Portuguese sailor called Vasco da Gama set off from Portugal, went down the coast of Africa, and went where no one had gone before. He went beyond it, all the way, in fact, to India, and back again to tell the tale. And as a result, the Portuguese government renamed this place from what it was, the Cape of Storms, to what we now popularly know it as the Cape of Good Hope. See, someone had gone past this place of storms and death and had come back to declare that it was a place of hope. And that is in many ways what the Bible claims that Jesus Christ has done. He is the one that has sailed through the storms of death and the unknown and has come back from death to say that there is a place of hope. He is our pioneer, our conqueror, who can give hope. But, of course, having said that, most of us are probably thinking, but how do we know? Isn't this belief in the resurrection, in life after death, and all of this kind of stuff just a pipe dream? How do you expect me, a reasonable, sensible, intelligent person, to believe something like the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Well, it is the foundation of the Christian faith, and so it's an important question to ask. How do we know that it actually happened? See, statistically, it's very unlikely, isn't it? We're talking about one occurrence in all of history. That's as statistically unlikely as you get. And medically, it's unrepeatable. We're not claiming that dead people rise all the time, or that I could do the same. We haven't poisoned your cakes, you'll be glad to know, and we're not going to try and reenact resurrections this evening. But though it's statistically unlikely and medically unrepeatable, the surprising thing is this, that when you start to look at the evidence, it's not as ridiculous as you might think. Of course, if you don't look at the evidence, it will of course seem ridiculous. But when you start to look at it, there's more going for it than you might imagine. And actually what might be even more surprising is that even amongst scholars who don't call themselves Christian and wouldn't necessarily believe even in the resurrection. There's a lot of agreement on certain facts in regard to this event. I want to give you 5 of them right now, and then we'll see what we make of them. Firstly, that Jesus died. I know there are some historians, there are some people who try and claim that Jesus never lived, and it was just a myth, and all of this stuff was invented. But interestingly, there are no serious historians that are willing to make that claim. We know that he lived, we know that he died under the Roman governorship of Pontius Pilate. We know that he was buried. The biblical records tell us that he was buried in the tomb of a man called Joseph of Arimathea. Now we know that Joseph was a member of the Jewish ruling council that had condemned Jesus as a group to death. And so people reckon that this would be a strange detail to make up if it were not in fact true. No competing accounts of burial are to be found, and people suggest that this must be reliable. Jesus died, he was buried. Thirdly, the tomb was empty 3 days later. In fact, for 200 years after these events, no one disputed the empty tomb of Jesus Christ, because the Christian faith would have never got going had the tomb not been empty. It would have been far too easy to disprove. There's also a couple of other interesting facts in regard to this, and that is that the eyewitness accounts of the resurrections, we find them in the New Testament, tell us that the first witnesses of the resurrection were in fact women. They were the ones who got to the tomb first. Now, we know, as anyone else does today, that women are just as reliable witnesses as anyone else. But in the first century, women were not regarded as reliable witnesses in a court of law. Which is a fascinating thing to bear in mind, because if you were making up the gospel accounts and you were fabricating a story about the resurrection that never occurred, why on earth would you invent the witnesses of that biggest event of all to be people who would have not been regarded in your society as reliable witnesses? I remember saying that to someone once, and they said, "Aha, there you go, it just shows that the resurrection didn't happen." And I said, "What, are you saying that women aren't as reliable as men?" And they quickly shut up. But it's an interesting thought. And what about this? There's an inscription found just up near Nazareth in northern Israel, Palestine, an inscription that dates from just after the events of the resurrection. And it's a Roman decree. And in it says that grave robbers are to be now punishable by death, which is a rather surprising thing, given that that's a very out of proportion punishment for such a, you might say, relatively small crime. And people suggest that this may be actually evidence that the news of the empty tomb had spread across the Roman Empire, and this was a case of trying to shut the gate once the horse had already bolted. The tomb was empty. The whole thing wouldn't have started otherwise. Here's the fourth thing. People claim that they had seen Jesus after the resurrection alive, in different occasions, in different places, sometimes individuals, sometimes couples, sometimes groups, on one occasion 500. And many of them were willing to keep to their testimony, even though it meant great personal cost to themselves. And here's the fifth thing. The church, the biggest sociological phenomenon in the history of the world, begun on the very basis of this claim and exploded into growth, not hundreds of years later, once the evidence was all long forgotten, but in the very place, and at the very time, when all of the evidence was still accessible, and no one could stop its growth, even though it was based on this claim of a resurrected Jesus. So there you have 5 things. Jesus died, he was buried, the tomb was empty. People claimed that they'd seen Jesus, and the church grew in the first century on this claim. Now you might say, well, that doesn't prove the resurrection. Well, actually, when it comes to history, when it comes to most things in life, proof is a very hard thing to come by. We don't prove many things. We're looking at where the weight of evidence lies. And when we look at the weight of evidence, we have to ask ourselves, well, what fits the evidence? And of course, through history and today, people will often come up with alternative explanations for the evidence that's available to us. Some people will say things like this: well, Jesus didn't really die. He passed out on the cross, and they obviously weren't so good at checking for signs of life and things like that. They rolled him in cloth, they put him in the tomb, he kind of came round in the cool of the tomb, and then he appeared to the disciples, and they thought that he'd actually risen from the dead. That's one suggestion. There's a few reasons why we don't think that could actually have worked. Firstly, the Roman soldiers crucifying Jesus had vested interest in wanting to do their job well. If the soldier, or if the crucified victim got away, as it were, it was their life in place of the one who got away. And also, in one of the eyewitness accounts, we're told that when Jesus' side is pierced, after the crucifixion, blood and water flowed out, which we subsequently know would have been medical proof of death, although to the eyewitness at the time he wouldn't have known that. And of course, you've got to think about this. Imagine somehow forgetting the things that we've just said. Jesus wasn't really dead, and he was put in the tomb, and he did come round. You've then got to imagine that Jesus, after the beating and the crucifixion, managed to somehow unroll himself from all of the burial cloths, and then roll the burial cloths back up, put them back on the side, push away this giant stone that had been put in the entrance to the tomb, managed to sneak past this whole detachment of Roman guards that were there to make sure that no one went in or out, run down the road, and no one would have been able to walk, let alone run after being crucified on the Roman cross, and then wash off his blood and convince his disciples that he wasn't a very sick man in need of immediate medical attention, but actually the crucified Lord who was the answer to death. And you think, actually, that's kind of straining the grounds of possibility somewhat. Well, that's one option. Here's another option. People say, well, maybe the disciples and the women went to the wrong tomb. Someone once said to me, well, they were women after all, and they're not very good at directions. Now, I would not say that, but that's what someone said. Or maybe someone else said they were following Apple Maps rather than Google Maps, and Apple just got the location wrong. Maybe that was the case. But, I mean, come on, if you've ever buried someone, or been at the burial of someone you love, you don't forget quickly where you buried them. And are you actually suggesting that these women, somehow went to the wrong tomb repeatedly, and the men obviously would also have gone to the wrong tomb repeatedly? And then when they started preaching this message of resurrection and the empty tomb, that no one thought to point out their mistake? I mean, the whole Christian faith would have been shot down in flames the moment they'd started. They would have stood up and said, Jesus is alive, his tomb is empty, and someone would have said, no, that's not Jesus' tomb, you idiot, that's Auntie Joan's tomb, and her body's been taken out of that years ago. They would have been the laughing stock of Jerusalem had they tried to do that. Here's a third thing. People say, well, was the body moved? Maybe it was the right tomb, but the body went somewhere else. Well, you have to ask then the question, who would have had the motive or the reason to move the body? Would grave robbers have done it? Well, why on earth would grave robbers risk trying to get into this heavily guarded tomb to steal the only thing that wasn't of value, a body, and leave the only thing that was of value, the grave clothes, behind? Would the Romans have moved it? Well, they could have potentially moved it, but why would they have wanted to? And why wouldn't they have unveiled the body when the message of resurrection started spreading? Would the Jews have moved it? Well, they had vested interest in wanting to make sure that people knew Jesus was still dead. They wanted that body staying right where it was. So the most likely candidates, of course, would be the disciples. Of course, that was the original story that was propagated by the authorities. They came while the guards were asleep, and they stole away the body. Of course, you have to ask the question, if the guards were all asleep, who saw them steal away the body? But again, you've got to ask the question, though you might want to suggest that the disciples have had a motive to steal the body, to give the impression of resurrection, why on earth did these disciples keep perpetuating the story when, rather than getting them into positions of power and influence, this story of resurrection was getting them killed? See, many times people might die for things that are not true, but people never die for things that they would know are not true. And if the disciples had moved the body, then they would have known full well that this whole thing was a hoax. And yet, they kept the story without budging to their dying deaths. Nearly all of the first apostles, tradition tells us, were killed for their faith in the resurrected Jesus. Normally, when the pressure is on, people speak out. Chuck Colson was one of the guys involved in the Watergate scandal, and Chuck Colson said this, take it from one who was inside the Watergate web looking out, who saw firsthand how vulnerable a cover-up is. Nothing less than a witness as awesome as the resurrected Christ could have caused those men to maintain to their dying whispers that Jesus was alive and Lord. They didn't move the body. They would have spoken if they had. Other people say, well, what about hallucinations? Would that explain away the resurrection? Maybe they just imagined that they had seen Jesus, or maybe they were just hallucinating. Well, so of course sometimes people do hallucinate. Sometimes people imagine that they've seen those that are dead. But normally that happens to specific types of individuals, it happens to individuals on their own, and they happen for an indefinite period of time. But these appearances of Jesus Christ happen for a very definite period of time with no repeat afterwards. They happen not just to certain types of individuals, but all sorts of types, and to often big groups at once, including 500 on one occasion. And hallucinations normally lead to the destruction or the breakdown of human personality, but in this occasion it's the appearances of Jesus that turn these timid disciples into fearless witnesses who are willing to put their own life on the line for this claim. So when you start to look at the alternatives, they don't really explain away the evidence. I'll give you one more recent one that was put forward by one scholar in America. He said, well, maybe Jesus had a twin brother, an identical twin brother that was separated at birth that no one knew about, and somehow he heard about the resurrection or the death of Jesus, came back for the funeral, was mistaken for Jesus, and they all kind of got it wrong ever since. Now, you're intelligent people, and you don't need me to start breaking that one down in the light of the evidence. See, here's the point. When you just think about the idea of resurrection, out of the blue, of course it seems ridiculous. As we said, statistically unlikely. But when you start to look at the evidence, you find that, as one person put it, there seems to be a resurrection-sized hole in history that only the resurrection could really fit. It's the alternatives that end up becoming more ridiculous in the light of the evidence that we have for us. Now you might say, look, it's all very well and good, but I just find this too hard to believe. I'm an intelligent student at the University of Bristol. I'm not a student at UWE, I'm at Bristol. Sorry, I might be a UWE student that snuck into notes. But you might say, look, for a 21st century materialist, I just can't believe in resurrection. It doesn't fit with my worldview. Well, of course it doesn't fit with your worldview. It's going to challenge it, isn't it? But neither did it fit with the worldview of first century Jews. And it was probably just as hard for them to believe as it is for us to believe. In fact, they didn't believe it because it was easy. They believed it because they were persuaded it was true. I'll explain why. On many occasions through Jesus' life, he had said to his disciples, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, and then 3 days later I'll rise from the dead. He said it quite plainly. And yet, although Jesus had said this on many occasions, when Jesus eventually does go to Jerusalem and he does die on the cross, and 3 days later, what do we find? You might expect the disciples to be kind of gathered around having a little meeting saying, guys, remember Jesus said, 3 days, let's go down to the tomb and check out and see if it's happened yet. And yet that hasn't happened, has it? What happens? The blokes are probably still in bed, because that's normally where blokes are, and the women have gone to, as far as they're concerned, an anointed dead body. Even though Jesus had said it was going to happen, they still didn't believe it was going to happen. Why? Because for first century Jews who believed that God had broken into human history, lived on planet Earth, died on the cross, and then risen from the dead 3 days later, was no more part of their expectation or worldview than it is for us. And they didn't believe it because it was easy, but they believed it because they were persuaded that the evidence left them no option. They were persuaded it was true. When we look at the evidence, there are many people through history that have come to that same conclusion. Here's one of them, a guy called Sir Edmund Clark, High Court lawyer. He said, as a lawyer, I have made a prolonged study of the evidence for the events of the first Easter day. To me, the evidence is conclusive, and over again in the High Court, I have secured the verdict on evidence not nearly so compelling. That's one lawyer. Here's another lawyer, Sir Lionel Luckhoo. Anyone ever heard of him? No, I don't think so. Anyone ever seen this guy? Lionel Hutz, yes, you've all seen him. Well, what you may not know is that Lionel Hutz in The Simpsons is actually based on the real life Sir Lionel Luckhoo. But there's a bit of irony that goes on, because Sir Lionel Luckhoo is actually in the Guinness Book of Records for being the world's most successful lawyer. He never lost a case. And so ironically, they decided to base Lionel Hutz on him, and he's never won a case. But so the real life Sir Lionel Luckhoo said this. He said, I say unequivocally, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubts. When you look at the evidence, you can find it to be compelling. Well, you might say, what difference does that make? Well, we're going to look at that in the second part. But first of all, you'll be glad to know, we're going to have some more music. And while we have the music, it'll be your opportunity to text in some questions. We're going to do it slightly differently tonight. Rather than having the questions right at the end, we're going to have 10 minutes for questions in just a few moments' time. So whilst the music's playing and you're enjoying that, if you've got questions on what you've heard so far, why not text them in, and then we'll have about 10 minutes to look at those before we wrap up and think about the implications of what this would mean for us and the world if it is in fact true. But first, Marina.
I will not tell you the title of the composition on purpose, because I think that music is the language that everyone speaks. And I wish I could speak any languages in the world because they're so beautiful. But music is the only language that everyone knows. And as I'm going to play, probably you have your own story that you feel and hear in this music.
does it make? There are lots of events in history that we probably don't dispute, but they don't necessarily have a big impact upon our lives. Whether the Battle of Hastings really did happen in 1066 doesn't keep me awake at night, and it doesn't have much relevance to my life right now. But I want to suggest if the resurrection of Jesus took place, it has the biggest implications of all. Let me give you 4 of them. Firstly, the future is certain. The future is certain. In the book of Acts in the New Testament, we read about how one of the early Christians, a guy called Paul, was speaking to a group of Stoic and Epicurean philosophers in the city of Athens. And he gave a speech about the God he believed in. And at the end of his speech, he said this: God has set a day when he'll judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed, and he's given proof of it to everyone by raising him from the dead. Paul is saying that all of history is heading towards a day when there will be a judge of history, and he says that judge is the one that is risen from the dead, Jesus Christ. If Jesus rose from the dead, it's really important because Paul says he's the one that one day will stand before. He's the one that history is heading towards. And if that's true, then it'd be worth thinking through, wouldn't it, very seriously, our attitude towards Jesus Christ. I'll give you kind of an illustration. A few years ago, I was driving from where I lived, down in Bournemouth, up to Suffolk, where I was going to have to confess, given what happened later, going to speak at a church. And as I was driving down, I think it was the A14, is it, through Suffolk, I was going down the dual carriageway, observing what I thought was the speed limit of 70 miles an hour. And as I came round the corner under a bridge, I saw at the side of the road a policeman pointing a gun, a speed gun, at me. And then, thankfully it wasn't the other kind. And to the side of him there was and I looked at him and I thought, well, that's fine, I'm doing 70, I'm all right. Then I looked at the side of him, there was a big red circle with the numbers 5 and 0 in the middle of the circle, and I realised that I was in trouble. And of course, because I was doing 70 by the time I'd really thought about this, I was now past him, and I looked in my rearview mirror, kind of hoping that he hadn't really seen me, and I was actually invisible. But to my horror, I noticed that he was getting into his car, he had put on his blue flashing lights, and he was pulling out into the road to follow me behind. Now, by this point, of course, I was a few hundred metres down the road beyond the police car, and I have to confess to you tonight that the first thing that actually came into my mind was, if you floor it, you can beat him. I was on the way to a church preach, but that was my first thought. I thought, gosh, and then, thankfully, the voice of reason overtook my brain, and it said, hang on, Michael, he's already got your registration plate. Even if you beat him for now, he'll catch up with you later. The better thing to do is to pull over and to face up to the consequences now. Which I did, got 3 points on my licence. But the point was, I could have said, I'm just going to try and ignore it, but actually, ignoring it wasn't going to help. And if Jesus Christ really is alive, and if there is a God that Jesus Christ revealed, and if he has risen from the dead, and if he is going to be the judge one day that history will stand before, that is really important for everyone, it's really important for us. And we can say, well, I'll just kind of hope for the best, that it's not going to happen. But actually, if there's even just a chance that was true, it would be worth thinking through, wouldn't it? Because if he's the judge that history will stand before, my attitude towards him really matters. And ignoring him, rejecting him, or even worse, ridiculing him through my life is a really unwise thing to do. The future's certain. Here's the second thing, the past can be forgiven. See, this is the amazing thing, we thought about this last night, that Jesus Christ is willing to say to people who have done that to him, rejected him, ignored him, and even ridiculed him, that he's willing to forgive us. We thought about last night how on the cross, Jesus was making it possible for us to be forgiven for our rejection of him, for our way that we've hurt others and messed up the world, that forgiveness is possible through the cross. And yet, if it was the cross alone without the resurrection, how would we know that Jesus' death really could bring about our forgiveness? How do we know that it worked? And the answer is the resurrection. The resurrection, in one sense, is like the receipt that proves that the payment had been accepted. And it's because Jesus is risen from the dead that we know that his claims have been vindicated and the forgiveness that he died to offer really can be offered to us. It's not a vain hope, Can I say that's really good news? Because that means that even if we have spent our lives ignoring Jesus as much as many of us have, and I did myself, and even if we do look at our lives and see that there's much in our lives that are wrong, this God is willing to accept us and forgive us against all the odds. He doesn't have to. We don't deserve it. But he's willing to because of the cross, because of the resurrection. There can be a fresh start, a past wiped clean, a restored relationship with God. The future is certain, the past can be forgiven. Here's number 3, today matters. You see, some people say, well, it doesn't matter what we think about the future, because the future's the future and today's today. But actually, the future does affect today, doesn't it? If I was to say to you, by the time you finish at Bristol University, actually, you're not going to get a degree. In fact, that was just a hoax, okay? And, all of those exams that you took, all of that coursework you did is going to result in absolutely nothing. It might change your perspective somewhat on whether to go to lectures tomorrow, wouldn't it? Your view of the future really does affect what you do now. But here's the point. If ultimately the future is heading to nothing, if death is the end and there is no God, have you ever asked what is the point of everything? I might achieve very much, but I'll leave it to someone else. I might have kids, but within a couple of generations they probably won't even remember my name. I might advance society and do good for the world around, but that society and this very world will one day just burn and be destroyed. What's the point? But actually, if Jesus Christ rose from the dead, there is a point, because the claim of the resurrection is not simply that Jesus rose from the dead and now we can float off to heaven when we die, but because Jesus rose from the dead, there is hope for these bodies and for this world. The Christian hope is not fluffy and cloud-like and quiet practice in heaven. The Christian hope is for new creation. That God will restore this physical creation that's been broken and damaged, as we thought about at lunchtime, but transform it. Not destroying anything that's good, but making it perfect. Taking away all that would distort and ruin it. And the Christian hope is that if I trust in Jesus, one day I will have a new resurrected body to live in that new creation. And so nothing good in that creation will be destroyed. So what I do now isn't just going to be burnt up. What I do now isn't just going to be forgotten. And because there is a real future for me and for this world, what I do now really does count. See, some people think that Christians only care about singing songs, praying and going to church, as if they're the only things that matter. Now, I love going to church, and believe it or not, I love singing songs. Whether other people love me singing songs is another matter, but you'll leave it to them to judge. But being a Christian is not just about that. It's about living all of life with a greater degree of fullness and joy, knowing that all of it matters. And so knowing that Jesus Christ is going to redeem all things means that Christians love music and the arts. It means they get involved in the environment. It means they care about their studies. They care about things because everything matters. Because one day Jesus is going to restore everything. The future's certain. The past can be forgiven. Today matters. And here's the last one. There is hope. There is hope. Joni Eareckson Tada was an athletic teenage girl in America. She was swimming one summer's afternoon in a lake, and when she dived into the lake from a pontoon, she dived off the wrong side and hit her head on the bottom of that lake. Her neck was broken, and for the rest of her life she's been paralysed from the neck down. But she's also a Christian, and she reflects on the hope that Jesus Christ has brought to her, and she says this: I can scarcely believe it. I, with shriveled, bent fingers, atrophied muscles, and no feeling from the shoulders down, will one day have a new body, light, bright, and clothed in righteousness, powerful and dazzling. Can you imagine the hope this gives someone spinal cord injured like me, or someone who is cerebral palsy or brain injured? Imagine the hope this gives someone who is manic depressive. No other religion, no other philosophy promises new bodies, hearts and minds. Only in the gospel of Christ, the hurting people find such incredible hope. Real hope for real people. When I grew up in Leicester, and I remember just before I went away to study up in Scotland, I got to know a family He was called Barry, his wife called Paula, and their kids. And we were working together on a project that summer. And when I went away to study, I got an email from him to say that his wife had got cancer. And she was taken for treatments. They did everything they could. But over the course of the next several weeks, they discovered that there was nothing more that they could do, and that she was going to die. And they gave her about 6 months to live. She didn't live for 6 months, she didn't actually make 6 weeks. And I'll never forget the funeral service for Paula. It was in a small village chapel just outside Leicester where they went each week. And it was absolutely packed with Barry, the kids, the extended family, her parents, and so many friends and family. And they brought the coffin into the church. But as they brought the coffin into the church, they played over the loudspeakers of the church a song. Now, many people who went to the church regularly were familiar with the song, but what made everyone sit up and listen was that the person who was actually singing the song was Paula. And in fact, she had sung the song just a couple of weeks before. She had asked for it to be recorded and then played at the funeral service. And the last verse of that song says these words: "No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man could ever pluck me from his hand. Till he returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ I'll stand." You see, for Paula, that was her hope. Not a hope that's too good to be true, but it's hope that is so good because it is true, based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And you see, these things are real. And Jesus Christ can make a real difference. And he can make a real difference to us if we let him in. I wonder if he's made that difference to you. Before we finish, I'm going to invite Nathaniel to come up. And Nathaniel's just going to sing one final song. Again, you might have heard Nathaniel the other night sing. And this is another song that he's written. And it's actually based on a verse that comes in the New Testament, in the last book of the Bible. And it's something that Jesus said. Jesus said, "I stand at the door and knock." Not the physical door of a house, but the metaphorical door of our lives and our hearts. And Jesus said, if anyone hears my voice and opens up the door, I'll come in and I'll eat with them and they with me. This beautiful picture of Jesus not forcing his way in, but waiting to be invited in to bring this forgiveness and this hope and this transformation. And he knocks at the door of my heart and yours. And our question is, what will our response be to it? Thanks, Nathaniel.
Quite understand. How can you fathom the brokenness of man? With you on your high horse, we're sinking in the sand. You don't know. At least that's what I've been told. Still small whisper inside is calling me out into the open. I don't know which way to turn, my heart is in a mess. Do you know? Do you know? It's not easy. But if there is someone like you, God, I want to open up, let it all out, feel your love, speak my doubts, hear your voice from this side of the door. I won't be alone anymore. I feel like you're never around. So what is this voice I hear that says safe and sound? I feel like I'm sinking but I fall on solid ground. And you know. So what are you going to do? You say I don't need your sympathy.